After a year of college, I decided that that world wasn't meant for me. I didn't know what I wanted or where I was going, but I knew that those classes, where other people seemed so eager to learn, was just not my place. So I dropped out, which my parents hated. I had to move out of the dorms, but they didn't want me back at home. So my brother Luke offered his basement apartment. He and my sister-in-law, Miriam, had used it for a while as an Airbnb, but he was tired of that service, so he agreed to let me stay for a third of its rent value, which I would start paying as soon as I found a job. I was so grateful, but what I didn't know was that my sister-in-law wasn't totally happy about it. Miriam was a kind of different person. Now let me explain further. I'm pretty fat. There's really no other way to put it. I've tried a million different diets and I simply just couldn't hack it. A lot of people in my family are pretty overweight, so I know that plays a factor, but I also just love food. I can't deny it. I don't know how people just eat for sustenance when good food can be so amazing. Now don't get me wrong, I actually do exercise a decent amount. I watch Zumba videos online and dance as much as I can. It's just I probably eat too much, and yeah, snacks are a weakness for me. And Miriam is the complete opposite. She's basically a model from the early 2000s era. You know, I can't comment a lot as I know I'm not healthy, but I know she barely eats to survive. I always felt bad for my future nieces and nephews because she was definitely going to be an almond mom. Now, all that wouldn't be a problem. Fat people and skinny people exist together in the world, and they seem to do fine. To each their own, right? Well, no. Miriam has detested me from the moment we met. She has been civil, but you know when someone just doesn't like you? Several slips in her attitude have told me that. Like at my brother's wedding, when she wanted pictures of the family and had me placed in the corner. She posted those on social media, cropped without me, and she framed some around her house. On her first Thanksgiving as my brother's wife, I saw her lip curling up whenever I dished more yams on my plate. She ate some turkey with no gravy and some asparagus. Very sad, but who was I to comment on her habits? The thing is that everything had been subtle with her. She never had to see me much, or I her, until I moved in. And I got the sense that it wasn't just my chubbiness that irritated her. She probably hated that my family is close and full of love, despite our appearances. My mom and dad aren't as big as me, but they're not model thin either. They're strictly average, but my dad showers my mom with so much affection. He calls her beautiful whenever he can and buys her gifts. It's something that I don't think I'll ever have, and I don't know if Luke feels that way for Miriam. But more importantly for this tale, it's that everyone seems to like me. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I'm funny and nice and I help wherever someone needs me. My parents weren't too happy with me about the college issue, but I know they love me unconditionally. And Luke is my best friend in the world. My big brother was always my biggest protector and my confidant, and I believe that Miriam hated that from the very beginning. But I never actually got any confirmation until I moved into their basement, and I didn't know that it would almost ruin my life. I moved in quickly. I didn't have much in my dorms anyway, and my brother and his wife helped. I saw Miriam's expression, though. When we were done bringing all my boxes, Luke went upstairs to check on something, and I started unpacking my clothes into a dresser, and Miriam had lingered. I told her that I could take care of everything else, and thanks for her help, but she remained in her spot. And I asked if she needed something, and she asked how long I was planning to stay there. I didn't know exactly, but I had already applied online for some jobs at a pizza place and a coffee shop and this pretty fancy restaurant. I thought, well, I love food, so I could just make it a career. I told her all that smiling, thinking that she was curious about it, but she just crossed her arms. "We can't stay forever," she insisted. And I said that I knew that, and I felt like she wanted to say more, but Luke came down again and she went quiet. Okay, I knew I had to save up, figure out what I wanted to do, make things better with my parents, and just get out of there fast. It just wasn't fast enough. That night at dinner, Miriam picked at her food, and that was normal, while I ate with gusto. My brother cooked well. We were both taught by my grandma, which was another reason why I thought a career in the food industry might actually work out. But after I dished some seconds onto my plate, Miriam spoke. "How can you eat so much?" she asked me. and her voice barely controlled the disgust. Luke frowned at that, and I know 100% that he had never heard her say something like that. "I'm fat. I can eat a lot," I replied and laughed, which made Luke laugh too. Miriam didn't find it funny. She said that being obese wasn't something to laugh about. She said all people had to think about their eating choices and how it would affect their lives later. She also added that as a girl she was taught to be strict and have discipline with food, otherwise she'd have trouble later in life, like she said. Her mother also told her that people would judge her for her looks. It was better to avoid that by always having a nice appearance. I rolled my eyes internally, and maybe I shouldn't have said what I did next, but I couldn't help it. It's okay. I may be fat, but everyone I care about loves me the way I am. And everyone else doesn't really matter, you know? Now, Luke agreed with me, and we pivoted the conversation to some of our childhood memories, and Miriam stayed quiet for the rest of our meal. In the coming days, Miriam was mostly quiet around me. I stayed in the basement and only went up for dinner because Luke insisted. She never commented on my eating again, but I did notice a lock on some cabinets in the kitchen. Well, that was odd. I had my own kitchen and food downstairs, and Miriam didn't care about eating, so I had no idea what that was about. But things seemed to escalate. My car keys went missing one day, and I had to go upstairs to ask if she had seen them. Miriam said she hadn't, which made sense because the basement had its own entrance. I asked her to help me to look, and she said no. She was busy with the magazine. Okay, sure. It was not her problem, but then I asked to borrow her car to go to an interview, and she said no, straight up, adding that I should just walk because I needed the exercise. I went away. I didn't have time for that, and then I ended up having to walk to the bus and to my interview. I had called my brother to ask if he had seen my keys, but he hadn't, so I would later need to get the second set that was at my parents' house. When they bought me the car, it had seemed safer to leave them the spare keys, but maybe that wasn't a great idea. And so that's what I did. I got a chance to talk to my mom, apologized about some things, and asked her to be patient with me because I needed to figure out my future. And she understood, I think. I got home and Luke called me up for dinner. He smiled and gave me the keys. Apparently he found them in the flower beds in the backyard. Well, that didn't make any sense. I didn't spend time in his backyard, much less near the flowers, because I was a little sensitive to the pollen. He told me to just let it go, and I did. But I started to grow concerned. Over the next few days, I had a couple more interviews, and although these places seemed swamped, none hired me. I applied to more places, willing to work in anything: delivery, cleaning, register, really just anything. When the manager of a little non-franchise pizza place called to reject me, I just broke down and cried right there. I asked him why I wasn't being hired. I just didn't get it. He said that someone called to warn him about me. What? He was told that I tended to steal food from all the places I worked at. I told him that wasn't true. I begged for the job, and he seemed to take pity on me, or perhaps no one else applied. Either way, that phone call changed his mind, and I was hired. Finally. I had to sit down after I hung up. I couldn't believe it. I had only ever had a summer job at an ice cream shop, and I never stole a single plastic spoon. The only person I could think of who had something against me was my sister-in-law, who just so happened to know everywhere I was applying to because I had talked to Luke about it each night at dinner. But unfortunately, I felt like I was being paranoid. I had no proof, and I didn't want any more trouble, so I just kind of kept my head down. I started my job. I took as many shifts as I could and ate on my own. I barely saw Luke or Miriam for around 2 weeks, and I hoped that that would be enough. But my day off proved it wasn't. The only downside of Luke's basement apartment was that it didn't have a laundry machine. Their house had a laundry room upstairs, which I had been using since I moved in, but I had put off cleaning my clothes since the job interview sabotage, and I couldn't any longer. I went upstairs as quietly as possible and started to load. I stayed in there and remained quiet. Anything to avoid her, I thought. But I don't know if something happened to trigger her or what, but she barreled in and screamed in my face that I had to get out of her house immediately. She couldn't stand me anymore and wanted me gone from her life. She said, if it was up to me, Luke would never have to see your fat ass again. I just stood there, shocked. I still didn't want any trouble, so I nodded and told her that I would leave as soon as my first paycheck arrived. My parents would help me, as they weren't so angry anymore. But it wasn't enough for her. She shouted again and again, "Get out, get out, get out," and suddenly lunged at me, grabbing at my hair. And that's where I had to draw the line, pushing her away. I must not have measured my strength because she flew back and hit the wall pretty rough. She started yelling, saying that I had assaulted her and said that she was calling the police. I went after her. She was the one who assaulted me first, but she had already dialed when Luke came in, thankfully. He had to witness this whole insane scenario play out. His wife talking to 911 while I stood next to her, not knowing what to do. But I went to his side and explained everything as quickly as I could before Miriam finished her call. She hung up and told him not to believe me because I had attacked her for no reason. I called my parents then. I knew that I had to leave no matter what happened next. The police actually ended up arriving a few minutes later, but my parents did too. My dad went straight to the officers. As someone who had never gotten into a speck of trouble in my entire life, I was terrified. And I cried as Miriam kept lying about what happened in that laundry room. I knew Luke wanted to defend me, but he hadn't been around, and he really just didn't know what to do. The cops didn't know what to think after hearing both sides of the story, but my dad convinced them to let us fix things amongst ourselves, and they seemed to agree. Miriam demanded a restraining order in that moment, but the cops just ignored her, and I'm so glad Dad was there. I whispered to my mother like a little kid that I wanted to go home with them, and they helped me pack. I don't know what Luke was thinking, but he carried boxes to my car in silence, and I just left without another word. I cried into my mom's shoulder that night because I didn't understand how someone could play with a false accusation like that. I told her that Luke's wife was a menace and that I never wanted to see her again. I know it put her and my dad in a very difficult position, but I was done with Miriam, and if I had to cut Luke out of my life too to avoid her, so be it. But after a few days, I realized that it was exactly what my sister-in-law wanted. I wouldn't have been surprised if she had planned that for a while, wanting for me to go upstairs while Luke wasn't home yet. I wasn't going to let her get away with this, I thought. I called my brother and apologized for everything, and we had a real heart-to-heart. He asked if I wanted to return, but I didn't. I just told him that I didn't want to lose him no matter my relationship with Miriam, and he seemed to sound relieved and very tired after all of this. And after that, I decided to execute my revenge, which wasn't anything masterful or movie-worthy. I just became a big, fat fixture in my brother's life. I went to his house for dinner every night, and sometimes my parents came. I was loud, talkative, and livelier than ever. I ate even more, praising my brother's cooking. I invited him on outings on the weekend, telling him to bring Miriam, of course, and she seemed to pull away more so every day. Not like a beautiful flower that matures and dies with time, but like a rat that eats poison and rots from the inside. Meanwhile, I was doing great at work and saving money. I had enough for a small apartment studio, but I hadn't moved from my parents yet. They were a good excuse to invite Luke to more things, and I needed Miriam to snap in a public way. And it didn't take long. On my dad's 55th birthday, my mom organized a barbecue with our closest family and friends. And once again, I was the life of the party. I put myself in every picture, made a little speech, talked to everyone, and tried to bring more attention to me while including Luke. I just knew that she was seething, and I was kind of just waiting. Now don't get me wrong, I was tired of this too. I was social, but not to that extreme, and I wanted to move on, but I also just deep down needed others to see the type of person she truly was. When the party was winding down, I decided to start picking up a few things and brought them to the kitchen. It was like the scene in the laundry room all over again. Miriam comes in, gets in my face, but she wasn't yelling, not at first. Her eyes were so scary as she told me that she knew what I was doing and how I had gotten away with my assault before. But she was tired of me and how much attention I had from Luke. I started laughing. I didn't want to, but it was hilarious to me. I knew that people willing to make false accusations were not people you wanted to mess with, but I had to goad her. I told her that Luke paid attention to me because I was his little sister and best friend in the world throughout all of our life. And I also added, he could easily leave you for someone else, but I'll always be in his life. And that was it. She grabbed my hair and started pulling, screaming the craziest things at me. How I was fat, ugly, how I would never do anything with my life, how she would get Luke to stop talking to me if it was the last thing she ever did. And I was in serious pain in that moment. My hair was too thin already, and this mad woman was going to leave me bald. But there was one final pull, and she was away from me. When I finally straightened up, I saw my brother's arms wrapped around her, and my parents were there with shocked but very furious eyes. It also seemed like the rest of the party wanted to know more, but they couldn't all fit into the house through the blocked back door. Luke pushed Miriam away, and she turned, giving him an excuse. Obviously, she starts blaming me, that I deserved it because I had assaulted her before, but I saw my brother's face, and he starts whispering to her to get out. It was so quiet that I don't think anyone else heard it in the moment. Miriam knew him well enough to understand his angry voice, and she left, huffing and puffing the whole way. Luke apologized to me about everything and left too, and the party got animated again with everyone wanting to know what the hell just happened. And I told them about the false accusation and how the sister-in-law just absolutely despised me. But here's the good news. At that point, and over a period of time, Luke filed for divorce. He came to stay with us for a while until they could settle some stuff, sell the house, whatever. And of course, he apologized to me a million times, and Miriam was out of my life for good, and the divorce was settled about a year later. Things are much better now. Luke and I live in our own separate apartments, and he's now dating an absolute gem of a woman, but I don't think he'll get married again anytime soon. And I come to find out that Miriam was actually struggling with some degree of ongoing drug issue, but Luke never really wanted to go into that. But after a period of time, it also started to all kind of make sense in my head. I felt bad for her, but I also was glad that I was able to get her out of his life to some degree in the end. A few years back, a few friends and I were hiking the Appalachian Trail not far from Allentown, Pennsylvania, when we found something that scared the crap out of us. We were taking a break at the small collection of rocks that sort of served as little chairs for us, when a friend of ours stood to stretch his legs a little and walked around his rock, and then noticed something sort of jutting out from the base. He reached down and pulled out what looked like an old-fashioned sort of tin of candy, the metal kind with a lid on a hinge. We start making jokes about how he's found someone's stash, but when he opens it, all he finds is these two dirty pieces of paper. He takes them out, sets that tin down in the rock, and then unfolds the first of the two pieces. He takes a look at one side and then turns it around to show us that it's just this sort of crude drawing of some rocks and some trees, presumably the same rocks and trees that we're at right now. But then, as he turns the piece of paper around to show us, he reads what's on the back of that paper, and his face just seems to drop. We ask what's wrong, and he reads the short message aloud. "This was the last thing Sarah ever saw," he said. And we all respond, "What? No way, dude, show us." And he wasn't lying. It really did say that. But then I ask him to unfold the other piece of paper, but he refuses. So another one of my buddies gets up and walks over and takes the unfolded paper from him. And then after unfolding it and briefly taking a look at what was written, his expression drops as well. "List of people I want to apologize to," he read aloud, and then went on to list a bunch of people that someone had apparently stolen from. first thought was that it was maybe a note that someone leaves before they take their own life, written by someone who liked to draw and refer to themselves in the third person or something. But then hearing how they stole from someone, that made me think that it was written in the third person because it truly was written by someone else. This sparked a lot of debate between us because obviously theft didn't exclude the possibility of someone dying. And Sarah could have stolen a bunch of money, regretted it, and then walked up into the hills to take her own life. But then surely a note like that would have included an apology to her parents or something. At least that was my take on it. Why only list the people you stole from? It took a minute before one of us thought to compare the handwriting on each note, but even then, we weren't all decided. The apology note was 100% written with a different pen, but the handwriting was so shaky that it's not out of the question that it was written at a different time, when the writer was feeling extreme emotions and all that. In the end, we stopped arguing over it and decided to look around for any signs of a body or anything. There was no chance of us just sort of slipping the notes back into the tin, sliding it back under the rock, and just walking away after finding something like that. Even if it was just someone's idea of some sick joke, then it was worth our peace of mind to make sure that we weren't leaving someone rotting in the woods. And we walked around for a while, but didn't find any bodies. We didn't find anything suspicious or anything either, and if I'm being honest, I didn't even know what I was looking for. I kept telling one of my buddies to watch out for disturbed earth, thinking there might have been a shallow grave under our feet. But then we were in the woods. All the earth is disturbed. And after that, we got to thinking on what we should do again, and we decided to take the box and the notes into the next town, and then drop them off at the precinct or the department of whatever kind of law enforcement-related place they had in town. And when we got there, we told the cops the same thing I just told you. It might be nothing, just a dumb joke or something, but we couldn't just walk off and forget that we ever found that tin and those notes. And to this day, it remains the creepiest thing I've ever come across while hiking. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, a place called Bakersville. It's only about 16 miles from the Tennessee state line, and beyond that lies the fabled Appalachian Trail. I never really considered it until I moved elsewhere, but there's a certain spirit to Appalachia, especially the lower half where the trail extends up into the Great Smokies and the Pisgah National Forest. Bakersville is about 20 miles north of Pisgah, right in the center of the triangle where the three forests converge. And I don't know if there's something in the trees or the hills or the water, but it gets into the people, for better and for worse. For example, Appalachians are just about the most superstitious people I had ever come across. Just about every culture has its little idiosyncrasies like that. You've probably heard someone say, knock on wood, to prevent something bad from happening. Or perhaps they suggested that a black cat crossing your path is an omen of misfortune. Some people are told never to walk under ladders or that stepping on a crack will doom their mother to a broken back. But of all the people I've met on my travels, Appalachians win the prize for their bizarre superstitions. For instance, my grandmother, God rest her soul, said she never trusted anyone with a dimple on their chin. She always used to say, dimples are made by the devil's shoe. And it wasn't just some silly saying to her either. She was deadly serious in her belief that people with chin dimples were essentially cursed. She also thought that if your chickens laid eggs in odd numbers, it meant misfortune was on the way, and that you should never, ever wash your clothes on a Sunday. She had a ton of other crazy rules like that, and like I said, it was no joke. She really did believe that if she did a certain thing, like wearing a buckeye in her bra to ward off rheumatism, it would achieve the desired effect. And she also believed in the power of bad luck and black magic with all her heart and soul. I guess we're just much more prone to believing in things like that down here in Lower Appalachia, things of an otherworldly or fantastical nature. And that's why I believe my friend Scoot wholeheartedly when he said that there was a witch living up near Rattlesnake Ridge. I didn't believe him when he first told me, but he said that his cousin swore on his eyes that there was a witch living out there in a one-room shack, and that she put a curse on 4 men just after the war, who'd all ended up dying in mysterious circumstances. But not only that, and thanks to his cousin, he knew exactly where this witch's shack was located, on the south side of Rattlesnake Ridge. Naturally, I demanded that he take me to it at the first available opportunity, to prove he and his cousin weren't a pair of no-good, rotten liars. But to my surprise, he indignantly promised to do just that. We were both 12 and 13 years old at the time, so we were capable of finding our way back after a lengthy sojourn in the woods, and aware enough for me to want to show Scoot what a long-tongued liar his cousin was. So, one Saturday we set off in the early afternoon, bound for Rattlesnake Ridge. I understand that probably sounds like far too dangerous a trip for a couple of boys in their early teens, but you grow up in rural North Carolina and you learn how to walk in the woods. I feel like there are stereotypes of the southern outdoorsman or Midwest mountain man, treading softly through the woods like a cross between a Choctaw and a ninja. But that's just not accurate at all. Any woodsman worth his salt treads heavy through the woods. Snakes pick up on vibrations, and the handy thing about rattlers is they let you know that they're there if they don't hear you coming and get out of the way first. Anyway, that's just to give you a little background on why our parents were okay with us hiking out to a place named after a venomous snake. From our neighborhood, the walk out to the ridge took about an hour at a casual pace, until finally, we see the tree-covered ridge rising up before us like some great sleeping giant. Scoot's cousin had said the witch's shack was on the southeastern side on the ridge, and that we'd smell the smoke of her fireplace before we ever saw her. This was the same fireplace where she supposedly cooked the butchered bodies of the children she captured before turning their bones into magical charms. I thought we'd spend an hour or two just wandering around, not being able to see or smell anything, before Scoot finally accepted that his cousin was full of crap. But then suddenly, we start to detect something that smells a lot like a campfire, or perhaps even the smoke billowing from the chimney of a witch's cottage. Scoot just about pops a gasket telling me, I told you he wasn't lying," in reference to his older cousin, and honestly, I'd be a liar if I said that it didn't send a shiver running through me. I just remember standing there, slack-jawed, having gone from not believing in him to not wanting to believe him. It was creepy, all right, but it was creepy in the way that a Boy Scouts campfire ghost story is creepy. Smelling that smoke in the way that we did, it had a kind of perfect timing to it. Like when the innocent high school couple discover the hook that's still buried in their car door, or when the babysitter learns that the call was coming from inside the house. It sent a shiver down my spine, and it couldn't have been real. There was no such thing as witches, and smelling campfire smoke was evidence of a campfire and nothing more. Once I realized that, I felt foolish. Scoot's cousin was lying, and feeling foolish only made me more determined to prove it. Plus, it was a fine opportunity to prove how brave I was to Scoot by marching off into the woods in search of the smoke source. He thought I was straight up crazy, saying that we'd had to get out there and that I must have some kind of death wish to go looking for that witch. After all, she'd already killed 4 men by putting curses on them, so there was no telling what she'd do to 2 kids who deliberately set off to go treading round her holler. I knew that whoever was out there probably wouldn't react kindly to strangers, but I also knew that there wasn't any such damn thing as witches. So I didn't exactly go running off through the woods, but I kept on going with Scoot behind me, keeping an eye out for where the smoke was coming from. Then, about 200 yards in, we see this thicket of myrtle trees, the real dense kind with the wavy leaves, and behind them is what looked to be an old log cabin, one with a big old stone chimney affixed to the side of it. And Scoot says, "You believe me now?" And I'll admit, the evidence was mounting in his favor. But until we saw black cats and flying broomsticks, I wasn't buying a word of it, and I wasn't about to go all that way, only to turn back now that we'd found what we were looking for. And so for anyone who doesn't know wax myrtles, they sprout fairly close to the ground, meaning you gotta duck down low, under all the leaves and branches if you want to traverse a patch of them. There was also the occasional dogwood in there too, meaning that we had to weave in and out to get to where we could see the log cabin in all its shabby ingloriousness. But when we did finally lay eyes on that cabin, it looked exactly like you might expect a witch's shack to look. There was a broomstick right there near the little entrance with all kinds of dried herbs, wind chimes, and charm-looking things hanging on either side of the door. Scoot just about had a fit when he saw the broomstick, and I have to admit, I was starting to actually believe it myself at that point. But then right as we're starting to get really and truly frightened, the door to the shack swings open, and out steps the witch of Rattlesnake Ridge. Her hair was white and patchy, and she walked with a bit of a stoop, and I swear that she'd had a wart or two on her nose and chin. I was just about ready to pee my pants with fear at the sight of her, cursing myself for not believing Scoot and his cousin, but at least I stayed quiet. Scoot, on the other hand, he blurts out in a shaky voice, "There she is," which the witch then hears and spins around to squint in our direction. She starts crowing, "Who's there? Y'all better show yourselves." But by that point, me and Scoot are bolting like startled foals, deaf, dumb, and blind to anything and everything except getting the hell away from Rattlesnake Ridge, and the witch we should have known better than to go looking for. We were terrified, absolutely beside ourselves with fear. We were convinced the witch was going to put a curse on us for having trespassed on her patch, and that it was only a matter of time before we too ended up dead under mysterious circumstances. We agreed to each head home to our parents to ask what they could do for us, how maybe the cops might be able to head out there and convince the witch to take back her curse. But whatever we did, we had to do it fast. So after issuing each other what we'd hoped would be not our final goodbye, we each headed home to beg our parents for help. I remember holding back tears until I got to my parents' house, but then the second I walked through the door and my mom asked me why I looked so terrible, I broke down and told her everything. How I hadn't believed Scoot and his cousin about the witch up on the ridge, how we trespassed on her property, and how we were now probably cursed to each suffer an untimely death. All the commotion brought my dad in from the garage, and he and my mother listened to the whole story before finally issuing their assurances. They told me that there was no such thing as witches, but that there was indeed an old woman living up near that ridge. She'd been living there for quite some time, and all she wanted was to be left alone, and that's why she'd gotten angry when she'd heard us in the bushes. She couldn't put any curses on us. We weren't going to die, but it was not a good idea to go wandering off into the woods like that for any reason, especially when that reason was to go bother some old little lady. And once I was safely reassured that the lady that we saw was most certainly not a witch, I started to calm down a little. But it didn't explain why a woman lived out in the woods, all on her own like that, and when I asked, I was essentially told that it was complicated, but that she wanted to live out there on her own. It wasn't like the people in town were mean to her or anything like that. And after that, my mom called Scoot's mom, and they talked it out to make sure everyone was on the same page. Scoot's parents were nice folks, so they told him basically the same thing as I was told. We didn't have to be scared of that old lady, but we weren't to go snooping around her property anymore. And Scoot and I were then allowed to talk on the phone, and we went from crying to laughing in the space of a few minutes. It was just pure relief, I think. That and how funny it was that we ran full sprint from a woman whose top speed was probably a mile or two an hour. We just kind of moved on after that. I remember thinking of that woman every so often, but I wasn't afraid of her. I just thought that she was kind of weird, living all alone in the woods like that. I didn't feel sorry for her. I mean, she chose to live out there. And I didn't know why, but I didn't care to know either. She was just the crazy cat lady who lived out in the woods, and just like everyone else in town, that fact grew as normal to me as just about any other thing. I guess a lot of other kids asked their parents the same thing. Scoot's cousin talked about the witch, and so did we when we returned to school that Monday. telling people how we'd been out there, and how she wasn't really a witch. And then we laughed off everyone who swore blind that she was, and that we were doomed to die any day from the curse that she put on us. The other kids had heard about those 4 men she supposedly cursed to die, but we knew better. We'd had grown-ups to tell us the not-so-scary truth, so we weren't afraid at all. And that pretty much settled the argument, as a bunch of other kids mentioned how their parents had told them the truth, too. She was just a sad, weird old lady, and those 4 men's deaths had nothing to do with her. But as I came to learn, that wasn't strictly the truth. The first part of this story, as in mine and Scoot's little encounter with the witch, that took place back in the mid-70s, a long time ago. And I remember it was around late April of 1975 because the TV had pictures of Vietnam on it almost nonstop. Things were turning real bad for the folks on the ground, and I remember my dad watching reels of helicopters lifting people off of rooftops in Saigon. And the next part, which doesn't really involve the witch at all, took place in 2004 when myself and Scoot were home in Bakersville visiting family. Now, there was nowhere to drink alcohol around Bakersville, so we had to catch a ride over to Burnsville, 10 miles south, so we could get drunk there before my sister drove over to pick us up come closing time. I hadn't seen Scoot in maybe 2 years at that point, and since the Panthers were playing that night, I wanted to whoop his ass at pool, and I thought that we'd take things over to a little bar down there so we could really make a meal of things. But anyway, we headed down there. Panthers lose their game, but I win at pool, so that just about evened things out. It was a weeknight too, so the place was pretty empty during the last hour of service. Just a few patrons in a few of the booths, then myself, Scoot, and this older-looking guy finishing our beers at the bar. Scoot and I are deep in reminiscing by that point, and we're talking about this and that until eventually the subject of the witch of Rattlesnake Ridge comes up. And we start laughing to ourselves, cursing his cousin for having us scare the bejesus out of ourselves like that. But then, with years of hindsight under our belts, we start kind of ruminating on why the witch was living out there in the first place. I'm sure she wouldn't mind us calling her that either. The reputation sure did keep folks from prying into her affairs too much. But it did strike me as odd that I'd never taken the time to really find out why she was out there. But also, who were those 4 men who supposedly had died? And why did people blame their deaths on our wicked witch's curse? We started speculating, very casually too, I do recall. I didn't think that she'd be around anymore. She was ancient back when we were kids, so we both agreed that she probably wasn't around almost 30 years later, not unless she really was a witch. Anyway, we're talking about her back and forth when suddenly, the older guy sitting down from us at the bar asked the bartender for one more for him, and one more for each of the 2 fellas he's about to tell a very long and eerie tale to. And then he invites us down to the stools to sit next to him and introduces himself as a former resident of our hometown, Bakersville. We introduce ourselves, thank him for the beer, and then ask him what sort of eerie tale that he has to tell us. We both kind of laugh. I should have known that it concerned the witch, and I guess I was a little slow on the uptake on account of the beers, but when he told us that he knew why the witch of Rattlesnake Ridge chose to live where she did, and what's more, he knew why people linked those men's deaths to her, my interest was piqued. The old-timer told us that if this was 30 or 40 years ago, he'd never have dreamed of telling us the truth. But since everyone involved was surely past by this point, the witch included, there wasn't any reason why we shouldn't know the truth, especially if we'd once seen her with our very own eyes. And foolishly, I started poking fun at the guy, probably due to all the beers again. It wasn't that he'd offered to tell us, nor was it that he did so in such a dramatic way. It's that he tried to tell us that the witch and the deaths of those 4 men I mentioned really were linked in some way. I started asking if she turned them into frogs or flew out on her broomstick to claim their souls on the night of the full moon. But the guy shook his head, evidently not appreciating my attempts at humor. He told us the men's death had nothing supernatural about them, but they were very much connected to both the witch and the reason she chose to live out there alone. He reiterated that if folks involved were still alive, there's no way in hell that he'd be telling the whole tale to a like me, in his words. So I didn't want to listen, and I could just take my beer and go jump in a goddamn lake. His words again. If I did want to listen, I could sit my ass down and find out why at least one of those men's deaths simply had to be connected to the witch, because one of the men had been her own goddamn husband. I then realized how terribly I'd misjudged this whole situation. In all my years, I never once heard anyone mention how one of the witch's so-called victims had been her own husband. The fact this guy knew that and was willing to tell us, that gave him this whole level of legitimacy. And so I sat my ass down and listened to what he had to tell us. The witch's name was Dora Ann Quinlan, and back in 1941, she got married to a man named James Cranwell. Their marriage was a happy one, at first anyway, and then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the whole world changed overnight for them. Cranwell was called up into the army, and then was sent off to fight the Germans in North Africa. And then at some point during his service, he was declared missing in action. A few months later, Dora Ann gets news that a whole bunch of American bodies had been found. Germans had taken him prisoner, then instead of taking them off to some camp, those Nazi bastards massacred them, piled up their bodies, and then set them on fire. Some of James's stuff was found among the charred remains, so it was assumed that he'd been among those executed by the Germans. She got the news in the late of summer of 42, and Dora Ann was devastated. She wore black for months, but by Christmas of 43, she was said to be getting cozy with a grocery store clerk who had been declared unfit for service. I don't think that you could find a single person who judged Dora Ann harshly for wanting to find happiness again, but all the same, she didn't want to sully the memory of her marriage to her late husband, so she opted to conduct the affair in secret. And that worked for them all throughout the early 44, but by the holidays of that same year, the affair was something of an open secret. Yet naturally, almost no one thought any less of Dora Ann for wanting to rekindle a little romance in her life, and so folks kind of just played dumb while silently hoping for some kind of marriage proposal. But then, in early 46, right when everybody is expecting Dora Ann and the clerk to tie the knot, she gets a telegram from the army with news that shook her world just as much as when those Japanese torpedoes sunk the Arizona. Her husband, James Arthur Cranwell, was alive. Cranwell had been a prisoner at one of those last camps to be liberated during the Allied march through Germany, and when he'd been found, he was on death's door. When he left the States, James was around 180 pounds, give or take, but by the time they got him back to the American Field Hospital, he didn't weigh an ounce over 95 pounds. Skeletal, they called him. But over the months that followed his rescue, he put on some weight, learned to walk again, and the first thing he asked was for his wife to be contacted so she learned of his survival. A few days later, Dora Ann gets her telegram, and she and her clerk know that their relationship is doomed. James comes home and the whole town welcomes him back as a hero, Dora included. But there's just one big problem. She doesn't want to end her relationship with the clerk, which results in them making a serious error of judgment. And one night, after a session of heavy drinking with his old high school buddies, James Cranwell comes home to find his wife in bed with that grocery store clerk. What happened next is something that almost doesn't bear repeating, so I'll try to put it in as implicit a manner as possible. Cranwell was furious. He beat the clerk to a pulp, tied him to the bed frame with his belt, and then set about teaching Dora Ann a lesson. But that wasn't enough. When his buddies tried to leave, Cranwell insisted they stay and watch.